Chapter 5, Railroad Man, Part 1, Friday, May 1st, 1868. Springtime, and the flowers were starting to bloom, leaves were coming out on the trees, and the robins were singing and singing. Will was whistling as he worked, spreading a fresh bale of straw in Piggy's stall, then grabbing some hay for her to eat and water to drink. Just as he was finishing, Levi came into the barn. His leg had healed up pretty good, even though he had a slight limp that required him to use a cane. "Hey, Will, how's my girl Peggy doing?" Peggy came over and nuzzled Levi with her nose. "She's great, Mr. Foster. With spring here, she's prancing around like a young colt." "So, Will, have you decided when you're leaving Amherstburg?" "Next week," Will said. "Have you told Mary Jane?" Levi asked. "Tonight. I've been invited to dinner after work, and when we go for our walk, I plan on telling her. I'm going to miss the McCurdy family because they have been really great friends," Will said. "I'm sure they're going to miss you too, and so am I. You saved my life, and if it weren't for you and Peggy, I would have been a goner," Levi said. "Oh, we never did anything special. Peggy and I was heading to old Sandwich Town anyway, so we didn't mind dragging you along," Will replied. The two began laughing as Peggy bobbed her head up and down and started whinnying, joining in the laughter. A week later, Will ran down the gangplank of Captain Sloane's boat to the Detroit dock. He jumped to the ground, and when his feet touched the American soil, he was sure that his destiny would be fulfilled in the United States. He stood on the shore for several minutes, just looking at the Detroit city skyline. He then walked over to one of the dock workers who were loading and unloading boats along the shore. "Excuse me, sir, can you tell me where the railroad station is?" The worker set the crate he was carrying down on the dock. "Sure, son, just last year, the new Brush Street station opened. It is located between the river and Jefferson Avenue. You can't miss it. Look for the big two-story red brick building that is 3 blocks long." "Why do you want to know? Are you taking the train somewhere?" the worker asked. "No, sir," Will said. "I'm going there to get a job." "Good luck," the worker said as he picked up his crate and continued towards the boat. Will grabbed his pole that had his clothes tied to them, put it over his shoulder, and headed downtown. When he reached the train station, he was amazed at how nice this new building looked. He went through the door, entering a large, crowded waiting room of men waiting for the departure of the next train. He noticed doors leading to the women's waiting room, a conductor's room, 2 telegraph offices, one for the Detroit and Milwaukee Railroad and the other for the Michigan, Southern, and Northern Indiana Railroads. There were also 2 baggage rooms and a refreshment room. A sign pointed upstairs to where the offices of the Detroit and Milwaukee Railroads were located. Next to the telegraph offices on the first floor was a door with a window, which had these letters painted on it: Michigan Central Railroad, Superintendent's Office. Will walked over and knocked. A short, balding man with horn-rimmed glasses set on the end of his nose opened the door. "How can I help you, son?" "Hello, my name is William Perry from the Elmstead Pew Settlement just outside Windsor, Ontario, and I'm looking for a job working on the railroad," Will quickly replied. The man standing in the doorway started laughing and turned to another man in the room sitting in front of a desk. "Hey, Cookie, this young man is looking for a job on the railroad." The man turned back to Will. "Come on in, son," he said, still laughing. He closed the door behind Will, then went and sat in the high-backed leather chair behind his desk. He faced the 2 men and then beckoned for Will to pull up a chair beside the other man he had called Cookie and said, "My name is Mr. Ferguson, superintendent of this railroad, and this is one of our best employees, Cookie. So, you think you're a railroad man. You look a little tall and skinny to me. What do you think, Cookie?" Will could tell the man sitting next to him was tall and slender, but his rolled-up shirt sleeve revealed muscular arms. His right arm had a deep scar that began somewhere under his sleeve, then all the way down to his wrist. Will learned later that Cookie was an American Civil War veteran and had worked on the railroad since the early days. He started out as a pantry chef where he would assist the cook, and eventually he did many other jobs. He was a brakeman, telegrapher, baggage man, special station agent, fireman, and conductor. He was finally offered a job as an engineer, but the old war injury to his arm began to act up, so he decided to become a cook on the railroad. "Well, Mr. Ferguson, I've seen all sizes and shapes of men working on the railroad in my day. There are a lot of Chinese that you would think were too small, but they are strong, strong men," Cookie said. Superintendent Ferguson looked at Will. We don't have anything just yet, but keep checking back and we'll see what we can do. Will thanked the superintendent and stood to leave. Cookie spoke up. You know, Mr. Ferguson, I had come here to let you know I had to fire the two brothers, Sam and Harley, for stealing food and not doing their job. I'll need someone to help with the cooking on the train. Do you think you can do the work of 2 people? Cookie asked Will. Yes, sir, I can do the work of 3 people if I have to. Will couldn't believe he had a chance to get a job on the railroad, and this fast, too. Doing the work of 3 people won't be necessary, Cookie said, smiling. I think doing the work of 2 should be enough. Mr. Ferguson turned to Will. If Cookie wants you to work with him, it's okay with me, so I guess this means you're hired. Cookie stood up beside Will and put his arm around his shoulder and said, Come on, Will, I'll walk you out. Thank you, Superintendent Ferguson, Will said as they turned to leave. Good luck, Mr. William Perry from the Elmstead Pew Settlement just outside Windsor, Ontario, Mr. Ferguson said, laughing as he closed his office door. Will and Cookie walked back through the crowded men's waiting room to the street outside. Where are you staying tonight, William? Cookie asked. I haven't found anything yet, sir. Do you know where a cheap, clean boarding house might be where I can stay? I sleep on the train, Cookie said, but I hear that the Second Baptist Church offers food, clothing, and shelter. From 1836 until 1865, when the Civil War ended, the church served as a station on the Underground Railroad, helping some 5,000 people escaping slavery in the South to freedom in Canada. I was told that Reverend Supply Chase, who's been pastor since 1861, is still there, and I'm sure he'll help you. After you start working with me in what I call my cookie car, I'll set up a spot for you to be able to bed down each night. I'll see you in the morning, bright and early at 3:30 a.m. That's when we have to start the fire in the stove so we can begin preparing breakfast for the railroad men before the train leaves at 6 a.m. One more thing, Will. Don't call me sir. That's what they called my daddy. Just call me Cookie. Don't worry about any last name for me. One name is hard enough for people to remember, Cookie said. Okay, thanks, Cookie. Cookie headed to the train at the side of the station and to his cookie car. He had taken an old railroad boxcar and fixed it up so he could live in it and do his cooking for the workers and passengers. This cookie car was attached just before the caboose, which was the last car of the train where the conductor stayed and kept his paperwork for each train trip. The caboose is the home away from home for most conductors, and so they would decorate them with some homey touches like carpets on the floor, curtains on the windows, and of course the family photos. Will watched as Cookie climbed up the train steps to his car, then he turned and walked in the direction of the Second Baptist Church. He entered the church, and at the front altar he noticed a lone person kneeling in prayer. He sat quietly in the seat at the back, waiting until the man was finished. After about 10 minutes, he stood up and turned and faced Will. Hello, my name is Reverend Supply Chase, pastor here at our humble sanctuary. And who might you be? William Perry from the Elmstead Pew Settlement, Will replied. I was told I should come here to rent a room for the night and buy some food. I just got a job on the railroad, and I start tomorrow. Are you any relation to the Perry brothers, Henry and Jim? Reverend Chase asked. I heard they stopped here before going to Canada traveling the Underground Railroad. I think it was in the late 1840s or early 50s. Yes, Pastor, they're my father and uncle. I never really knew them, Reverend Chase said, but I heard they were fine young men. So, you're their kin. Well, young William, we don't rent rooms or sell food. Everything is provided by the generous donations of our members. I can help you with your needs tonight, and if you can afford a donation, it will be appreciated, and that allows us to help the next young lad that may be less fortunate. We have assisted others at the church since our first pastor, Reverend William C. Monroe, who served from 1836 to 1846. He believed that we must go beyond just the spiritual needs of the congregation and also assist in their political and economic freedom. Reverend Chase took Will to a small room to the right. Inside there was a neatly made-up bed in the corner, and beside it was a small dresser with a mirror. Sitting on top of the dresser was a wash bucket with a pitcher of water, and beside the pitcher were 2 folded towels, a large one and a smaller one. Reverend Chase instructed Will to put his bundle of clothes down on the bed and to follow him so he could show him around the church. While they walked, Reverend Chase gave Will a little history lesson of Detroit and the Second Baptist Church. He said there were about 70,000 people living in Detroit. A new mayor, William W. Wheaton, had just been elected, and the city was looking forward to some positive changes and growth under his leadership. Will also learned that on July 24, 1701, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, accompanied by approximately 100 fellow Frenchmen and 100 Algonquin Indians, established Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit in what today is downtown Detroit. He also learned that the Second Baptist Church was started in 1836, when 13 men and women received permission from the territorial legislature of Michigan to own and operate their own church. The church was the first in the Midwest to be founded by African Americans. This was Detroit's seventh major church after St. Anne Catholic, First Presbyterian, Central Methodist, St. Paul Episcopal Cathedral, First Baptist, and St. Mary Catholic. Will was impressed with the history lesson he was just given by Reverend Chase. He promised himself that he would attend this historical church whenever he was in Detroit. Reverend Chase ended their tour by taking him to the kitchen, where he made Will a sandwich and gave him a warm cup of cocoa. After finishing his meal, Will retired to his room to get some rest for the exciting day that faced him in the morning. Will woke up at 2 o'clock, and since he couldn't sleep anymore, he washed his face and hands and then headed out of the room. He stopped long enough in the sanctuary to put a donation and a thank you note in the collection dish for Reverend Chase. When he stepped out of the church, the stars were still twinkling in the sky and the moon was full. He took a deep breath, began whistling, and headed to the Brush Street train station. He entered the renovated cookie car and found Cookie already had water boiling on his hot stove. He was surprised at how Cookie had everything in his car so organized. From the ceiling there were different sizes and shapes of pots and pans hanging from hooks that were far enough apart they wouldn't hit each other from the motion of the train. All of his food supplies were neatly stacked on shelves that were built along the walls of the car. There were wooden strips in front of each shelf so nothing could slide out. The pots, pans, and foodstuffs could conveniently be reached by Cookie as he stood over his stove that was anchored in the middle of the car. At the far end he had an area that was divided from the rest of the car by a curtain, and this was where Cookie had two cots, one for him and one for Will. The whole place was so spotless you could eat off of the floor. The only thing Will noticed missing were Cookie's family photos. "Good morning, Cookie," Will said. Cookie, whose back was to Will, waved hello while still holding a big spoon in his hand. "Morning, Will. I didn't expect you for another hour or so. I like it when someone shows some gumption. Put your things down and go over there and wash your hands. You might as well start doing the work of two people," Cookie said, laughing. The more Will got to know Cookie, the more he saw how often he would smile and laugh. For someone who had probably seen many horrors during the Civil War, he sure seemed to come through it without being bitter or overly upset about the experience. "Hey, Will, can you grab that big box of dry porridge on the middle shelf? This water is hot enough to pour it in. I want everything ready by the time the workers wake up." Will grabbed the box, moved towards the big pot, and began pouring as Cookie instructed. Next he gave Cookie the salt and other special ingredients that Cookie said gave his porridge and the other foods he prepared a flavor that made his cooking famous along all the railroad lines. It had been said that you could blindfold any railroad man from here to Topeka, Kansas, and then give them a taste of Cookie's food, and they would recognize it as being his. This is why Cookie took pride in what he did and would only tolerate people around him that felt the same. He soon learned that he had the perfect apprentice in William Perry, because he came from a family who, no matter what they did it to the best of their abilities. After the final ingredients were added to the porridge, Cookie covered the pot with a large lid to allow everything to simmer. He and Will each grabbed a loaf of fresh bread that Cookie had baked overnight in one of his two wood-burning ovens, which were located side by side at the far end of the car. They laid the bread on a cutting board table that was next to the stove where the porridge was cooking. Under the table, Cookie pulled out one of the drawers and took out two large knives. He handed one to Will, and together they began slicing the bread. To preserve some foods longer, Cookie had built a wooden icebox that looked like a piece of furniture. It was made out of solid oak with hollow walls that were lined with tin and packed with sawdust and straw for insulation. A large block of ice was held in a tray near the top of the box, and the cold air circulated down and around the storage compartments in the lower section. Cookie had even added a spigot on the side for drawing glasses of ice water from the melting ice block. He kept his perishable foods in there, and this is where Will got a big slab of butter for the bread. It was obvious Cookie had prepared food on many occasions, because his timing was perfect. Just when everything was ready, the workers started filing past the cookie car for their meals. "Hey, Cookie, I see you have a new helper today," one of the men said. "I'm glad you got rid of those brothers Sam and Harley. I knowed them boys was bad news from the get-go." Within an hour, Will and Cookie had fed the crew, cleaned up, and were ready to feed the passengers once the train had left the station. During all this time, the two of them had not done a lot of talking other than the conversation related to the task of preparing the meals. When everything was finally finished, Cookie filled a couple of cups with water from the spigot on the side of the ice box, and then together they sat on the floor at the side of the boxcar, with their legs dangling outside the big open door. Cookie reached in the pocket of the apron tied around his waist and pulled out an old corncob pipe, similar to the one Will's A Doo-Doo White Cloud had. Cookie stuck it in his mouth, then leaned back against one side of the open door and said, "I don't put tobacco in my pipe, because smoking is not good for you, but I like to put this pipe in my mouth because it sort of relaxes me. It's a habit I picked up during the war." "Where are we going today?" Will asked. In all the hustle and bustle since this morning, he had never had the chance to ask this question. "Ypsilanti, Michigan. That's one of our regular runs on this train line, along with other places," Cookie answered. This has been a popular run for the Michigan Central Railroad since February 3, 1838, when passengers rode the train from Detroit to Ypsilanti for the first time. By 1860, the railroad built a 3-story brick depot in Ypsilanti because more and more people traveled this route, Cookie told him. "Fantastic," Will said. "I can't believe my first trip on the train is to the place my brother Joseph lives." At 5:45 a.m., the conductor walked up and down the station platform, shouting, "All aboard for Dearborn, Inkster, Ypsilanti, and all places in between." Passengers from both the men and women's waiting rooms filed out of the station. They began entering the passenger cars as the conductor punched a hole in their ticket. At 6 o'clock a.m. sharp, the engineer blew the whistle and the train slowly moved out of the station. The trip to Ypsilanti was a long journey because of the many stops the train had to make along the way. Dearborn, Inkster, and Ypsilanti were the main ones, but the train also stopped at smaller villages and hamlets to pick up fruit, lumber, vegetables, and other produce to take to the city markets. When the train would arrive in Ypsilanti at 5 p.m., the crew would drive the train into the roundhouse. They would then turn it around 180 degrees on a turntable, which was a bridge mounted on a center pivot. The train would then be ready for the return trip to Detroit at 6 a.m. the next day. Cookie and William stayed busy for the entire trip. First they prepared breakfast for the passengers, and then by the time this was completed, they immediately began to prepare lunches. The food was taken to the dining cars during one of the frequent stops, and the staff in these cars would serve the passengers. Most train lines would only provide food at the many stations they stopped at along the way. The cookie car, however, provided a special service for all those who traveled on his train, where the passengers could eat between stops. This enabled the train to not have long layovers waiting for people to eat when they were at the stations. By the time the train pulled into Ypsilanti, Will was exhausted, but he was happy because he had never done anything so stimulating in his life. He felt like he was on his way to becoming a railroad man. Ypsilanti was a nice little city. The homes were built among lots of trees that made the place look more like country than city. Will had left his friend Cookie back at the cookie car while he went searching for his brother Joseph. He had the directions written on a piece of paper that his parents had given him in case he ever went to Ypsilanti. "Boy, would they be surprised if they knew I was here and going to see him," Will thought to himself. Joseph was staying at some relatives of the Perry family, Samuel and Margaret McGinnis Bass, who lived on South Grove Street, a block or so south of Michigan Avenue. Samuel and Margaret had moved to Ypsilanti from the Chatham, North Buxton area of Ontario, Canada. Margaret was born in Scotland on April 27, 1850, and had come to America to visit some relatives. Samuel was born in Vermont on December 22, 1838, but eventually he migrated to Raleigh Township in Ontario, where he had a farm on Concession 8, Lot 24. Samuel was doing some work for Margaret's relatives, and this is how they met. A few months before Joseph went to Ypsilanti, they had their first baby, a little girl named Catherine. They had invited Joseph to come and live with them because of all the jobs available. People were very friendly and helpful in directing Will as he made his way to the Bass family residence. When he arrived at Samuel and Margaret's, they were excited to see him. "Cousin William," Uncle Sam said, "welcome, welcome. It is so good to see you. How's the rest of the family?" Samuel was a good-looking, big man with hair that was white as snow caused by premature graying, a trait his whole family inherited. Will called them Uncle Sam and Aunt Margaret, even though they were his cousins. "Everyone back home is great, Uncle Sam. How are you and Aunt Margaret doing?" Just then Aunt Margaret came in from the kitchen wiping her hands. She was always in a good mood and one of the best cooks Will knew. On her back in a baby bag was their new baby Catherine, who was sound asleep with her head resting on her mother's back. "Come here, boy, and give your Aunt Margaret a hug," she said, holding her arms open wide. Will walked over, hugged his aunt, and kissed his baby cousin Catherine. He loved his aunt because she was always so nice to him. "Have you come all the way to Ypsilanti to see your brother?" his aunt asked. "Well, I work on the railroad, and this is one of our stops, and since I am here overnight, I just had to see him, and of course you and Uncle," Will said. "That's very nice, but Joseph isn't here now. He's working at the brickyard, but should be home very soon. Come on in the kitchen and let me feed you while you're waiting," his aunt said. Will and Uncle Sam quickly followed her into the kitchen because they knew they were in for another one of Aunt Margaret's wonderful meals. They had just finished eating, and Will had gone to the bathroom when Joseph walked in and, as usual, kissed Aunt Margaret and said hello to Uncle Sam. "You've got company," Uncle Sam said as Will came up behind his brother. "Brother Will!" Joseph turned, surprised to see him. "What are you doing here in Ypsi?" "I'm a railroad man," Will said proudly. "We're on an overnight stopover. I return to Detroit tomorrow morning. This is my regular run, so I'll be here every couple of days." "Great," Joseph said. "Let me show you around town. I've made a lot of friends in the last year, and I want them to meet my little brother." "Before you boys go anywhere, you sit down and have your supper first, Joseph," Aunt Margaret demanded. "Yes, ma'am," Joseph politely said. He went to wash up while Will waited outside on the porch with Uncle Sam. "So, William, how do you like our little city?" Uncle Sam asked. "From what I've seen so far, I like it, and the people are so friendly. This place reminds me a lot of our Elmstead Pew settlement, only more people," Will said. "This place was originally a trading post established in 1809 by Gabriel Godfrey, a French-Canadian fur trader from Montreal," Uncle Sam said. "And then in 1823, Major Thomas Woodruff established the village of Woodruff's Grove on the east side of the Huron River, where it became part of the territory of Michigan. June 19, 1832, the area became the village of Ypsilanti, named after Demetrius Ypsilanti, a hero in the Greek War of Independence. We became incorporated as a city on February 4, 1858, and all of us that live here refer to our fine city as Ypsi." Uncle Sam told Will more about the city, and just when he finished, Joseph came out the door. "Are you ready, little brother?" Joseph asked. "Come on, let's go explore Ypsi." Uncle Sam watched as the two brothers walked down South Grove Street, laughing and talking as they went. "First place I want to take you is to my girlfriend Stella's house. She's a beautiful girl, smart, and one of the kindest people you'll ever meet," Joseph said. From the sound of his brother's voice, Will could tell that this girl was obviously someone very special. "Only question I have," Will said, "is how did a big old ugly guy like you get a girl in the first place?" Joseph playfully put Will in a headlock with one arm and rubbed his head with the fist of his other hand. He then pushed him away as the two continued walking and laughing. Joseph was right about Stella. She was everything he described and more. She and Will got along really well, and Will knew that she would be a great sister-in-law for him, just like young Jim's wife, Annie Sue. The three of them spent the rest of the evening together until it was time for Will to return to the train station. When they were saying their goodbyes, Stella said to Will, "Next time you're in town, I want you to come to our house for dinner." "I would love that," Will said. He hugged and kissed Stella on the cheek, did the same to his brother Joseph, and headed back to the train. When he got to the Cookie car, he found Cookie lying on his cot, moaning in pain and holding his arm that had the long scar he received in the war. Will quickly went over to his friend and sat on his cot, which was across from Cookie's. "Are you okay?" Will asked. "This darn arm is acting up again. Don't worry, though. It does this once in a while. I'll be all right," Cookie said. Will knew he would be, but he wondered what had happened to Cookie's arm during the American Civil War. He had asked a few times on this trip to Ipsy, but he could see Cookie didn't really want to talk about it because he would always say, "Oh, it's really nothing, just a little scratch." Will could see by the length and width of the scar there was more to the story than that. In the morning, Cookie was still not feeling well, so Will told him to stay in bed while he began preparing breakfast for the train workers. A couple of times Cookie attempted to help, but Will insisted he had everything under control and made him lie back down. "I told you I can do the work of 3 men," Will said. "You just relax yourself." As he began falling asleep, Cookie thought about how lucky he was that Will had came into Superintendent Ferguson's office the other day. He is the best assistant he had ever had. When Cookie finally woke up, the train was just pulling into the Dearborn train station. He couldn't believe he had slept that long. He looked around the Cookie car and could see Will had not only fed all the workers and passengers, but had already cleaned up the car for the day. "Hello, sleepyhead," Will said to Cookie. "Are you feeling a little better?" "Much better," Cookie answered. "All I needed was a little rest. I can't usually get a lot around here because of all the work that has to be done. I see you have everything taken care of. Thanks, Will." Will sat on his cot across from his friend and talked as they waited while the train was unloaded of some of its cargo and loaded up with other produce for the Dearborn community. Will asked Cookie again about the old war wound to his arm, and again Cookie said it was nothing serious. So this is the way Will spent the rest of 1868, traveling back and forth on the Cookie car between Detroit and Ipsy. The highlight of each trip was when he would see his brother Joseph, his girlfriend Stella, Aunt Margaret, and Uncle Samuel.